Welcome to this morning's plenary talks. I like to think of them as lightning talks, and you'll see why in a few moments. The session is on transparency and recognition in peer review, and our first speaker has helpfully come up with 7 definitions of different kinds of open peer review, and they're posted on the board over there. For the purposes of our discussion today, we'll mostly be dealing with open identities, which is where the authors and reviewers are aware of each other's identities, open reports, where the reports are published along with the paper, and open interaction, where there is interaction between the reviewers and the authors, and also between the reviewers. So this morning's talks will also address whether peer review, whether it's signed or not, should be part of the scholarly record, and whether peer review itself should be recognized and valued as an important scholarly contribution. These are all really interesting ideas and points, and our speakers this morning will give you a taste for what they've been doing in this area, and then we'll be able to really dig into some of those questions more thoroughly at the breakout sessions. So we'll start. I don't see this first speaker. Oh, there he is. We'll start with Tony Ross-Hellog.
Hello, good morning. There we go. So thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to this very important meeting. I'm afraid I've got the man flu. Hopefully I'll be clear and coherent, but if I'm not, I'll at least be brief. I'm Tony Ross-Hellog. I now work for the Know Center. We're a center for data-driven business, and I'm a postdoc researching open science there. The work that I'll talk about today, I did in my last role as scientific manager for the initiative Open Air at the University of Göttingen. And Open Air is an initiative to implement and monitor open science in Europe. And this work was motivated by the fact that we saw that open peer review was becoming an ever greater part of the open science discussion, but that very often there's very little clarity on exactly what we mean when we're talking about open peer review, and that there hadn't been a great deal of research into exactly what researchers want when it comes to peer review, open peer review. So, as Bojana said, I developed this list of 7 individual traits. I did this by analyzing the literature. I did a systematic review, found 122 definitions and categorized them, and found that, in fact, amongst those 122 definitions, there were 22 distinct configurations of the 7 traits that we identified. And if you think that those are distinct configurations would become distinct peer review systems with their own advantages and disadvantages, then the question of what works in which circumstances becomes very important. The next part of the research was a survey, which was done in the autumn of 2016. It was an online survey, open for a month. We managed to get more than 3,000 full responses from authors, reviewers, editors, and publishers. This was just published in PLOS One in December. It's available online. And there you can see the names of my co-authors in this, Arvid Depper and Birgit Schmidt. So I'd just like to say thank you to them as well for their work on this survey. So I'll just outline in broad terms what we found. So first of all, we asked general questions about open access, open data, and open peer review. And we found that levels of enthusiasm for open access were generally highest, then open data, and then open peer review as well, which you see perhaps reflecting that it's not quite as full a part of the academic conversation yet. Enthusiasm was a little less, but still 60% of our respondents thought that open peer review should be common scholarly practice. This means open peer review is already mainstream. We next asked whether our respondents thought that individual traits of open peer review would make peer review better or worse. And here you'll see that the plurality, or the majority in most cases, for 6 out of 7, think that these traits would make peer review better. In particular, there was very high enthusiasm for open interaction, which is a direct discussion between authors and reviewers, or between reviewers, more of a consensual model, trying to come up with a consensus rather than an adversarial model of peer review. There was very high support for open reports, as well as for open final version commenting. And here we see that researchers support open participation, they support commenting, but as we know, in particular from the recent sad news about PubMed Commons, very often motivating these comments, motivating this participation is a problem. Digging down a bit into, so at the bottom there we can see one of our major findings was that there is this strong pushback against open identities. So there is concern that opening reviewer identities would not be an improvement to open peer review, and we dug down into that. So almost 3/4 think that the reviewers should have the choice, at least, whether they make their identities open or not. They thought that if a journal insists on a system of open peer review, that there would be, that it would make it harder to find reviewers. And there's a concern that the strengths of the criticisms would be tempered within open peer review. You can see this either as a good thing or a bad thing. You can see this either as people have to put their name to something, so they're actually being nice when they make criticisms rather than being behind the curtain adversarial. But you could also see it as they're being less honest in their criticisms. Two more things breaking it down. So we found that these attitudes varied by age group, as you might expect. Younger generations are more enthusiastic, apart from the over 65s. I don't know why. Maybe you just don't care anymore at that point. And we also dug down into the individual disciplines, and you'll see here, I really can't give you a simple answer here because basically it's complicated. So there we have health sciences. You see quite enthusiastic, and life sciences. Where am I? Can you see it? Fourth. Yeah, less enthusiastic. We need to understand better what these disciplinary differences are. So to sum up, 40 seconds. Open peer review is already mainstream. We found that more than 3/4 had practical experience as an author, editor, or reviewer. 60% believe open peer review should be common practice. Positive reactions to most open peer review traits, especially open interaction. And this is an area which I really think that we do need to look at in more depth. Rejection of open identities, generational differences. Final 10 seconds. Open peer review so it's a very complex issue. So there's a lot of different types of systems that we could be implementing. Which is best? We don't know really. There's in the paper in which I came up with this taxonomy, I looked at the evidence for each of these traits, and very often it's 1 or 2 or 3 studies, very often in distinct disciplines. So, for example, at the BMJ, Theo will talk about their work, but work in medicine is different to other disciplines, and attitudes are different, and the needs are different as well. And so we need more evidence on what works in which cases. And when you think about it, if peer review is really the bedrock of quality assurance of science, and it is pretty outrageous that we don't have a fully informed program to look at what works in what circumstances. So what I would like to see, open peer review has a great advantage in that a lot of that data is already open. Let's collect it in one place and make it available for researchers. So, and then let's come up with multi-stakeholder agreements on definitions and priorities for research. For example, against open identities, a very common concern is that younger researchers would be at risk from these older, vengeful professors who don't like criticism. Is that true? Let's find out if it's true. And if it is true, let's find ways to mitigate that. A lot of this is based on fear and supposition, and that's not what we're about. It's crazy that that's the way that we treat peer review, really. So let's come up with multi-stakeholder agreement on definitions and priorities for research. Let's do cross-publisher studies on what works and what doesn't. And to push this forward, at the end of March, organized by a project that I'm working on, an EC-funded project, Open Up, we'll be holding a small workshop in London on the 27th of March. If you would like to come, please let me know. There are still a few places available. Some of you will be there, I hope. And let's get all the data, sorry, I've gone way over. But let's get all the data in one place, and let's try and motivate researchers to find out what works and what doesn't, so that we can put open peer review on a real scientific basis. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Rebecca Lawrence from F1000, and thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk. So I was going to give a brief summary. There's a commentary on the Asset Bio site that gives a bit more detail, but I was going to use this opportunity to give a brief summary of what we've learned from operating a system that is very much along similar lines, some of the things that are being proposed here, really sort of combining a preprint-like service, with post-publication peer review. I can get this, persuade it to do something. No? Perfect, thank you. Okay, so we set up our own platform, F1000 Research, just over 5 years ago, to really develop a completely different way of publishing, for all the reasons that actually Erin gave a fantastic summary yesterday of the problems and the challenges and some of the solutions around it. And we've used that time to really develop the model. We've learnt a lot during that time. We've tweaked and adjusted it, and we now think it's working pretty well. We've also shifted from being very much a publisher to being much more a service company, and I think this is really important. I think a lot of publishers are now making this shift, so that we are now providing as a service the tools and the infrastructure and the editorial part of the service to other organizations and other communities. So we've started working with a number of big funders and institutions, particularly, so the Wellcome Trust were our first partner, followed by the Gates Foundation and many others. And a key thing to note with these platforms is that they are not owned by us. They are owned and controlled by these organizations. We are simply service providers to provide that infrastructure and provide the tools and the services that go with it. We also set something up called Open Research Central, which is an initial portal to try and pull all the content together, because of course a lot of research is co-funded and from researchers from different institutions. And ideally, in the future, we think it makes sense to be able to publish directly onto a central portal that should be owned by the community, and then that you evaluate that research separately to the publication process. But we think it's a part of a trajectory to get to that point, which is why we're working with those major organisations to represent researchers, to support researchers in going that direction. Very brief summary of the model. There's sort of two components to it. One is very much like a preprint, has some key differences, which I'll explain in a minute. But the first part is like a preprint. We submit, we do some checks, and then we pass them and we publish. The second part is post-publication peer review. There's a key point here is that the term post-publication peer review is used to describe all sorts of things, including commenting. We talked about PubMed Commons yesterday. This is not what this is. This is formal invited peer review. It's just after publication. So the checks, we do obviously a lot of checks very similar to preprint servers, but we also do a number of checks that are much more like traditional journals. Does it meet ethical requirements for consent, and particularly in medical papers, looking for images and all sorts of things around that. looking at whether the research meets community standards, so checking against guidelines to make sure there's detailed methods, for example. So this very much goes to Mike Lauer's point yesterday, making sure that we've at least got the detail as to how those studies are done to try and support reproducibility. And we also have a mandatory requirement that source data is available and that it's there, it's accessible, it's in the right formats, in the right locations, etc. So about 75% of submissions to F1000 Research pass those checks. So this is after we've potentially been back and forth with the authors, and about 86% on welcome. And actually the majority of those on welcome that don't are because they're not grantees. Just having that data there. The process is very fast compared to the 9 months that Erin quoted yesterday of the typical publication process. Here it's between sort of 14 to 16 working days, which is made up of the pre-publication checks, clearly very fast, a couple of days. Obviously the authors dealing with the pre-pub queries, takes them as long as they decide to take. And then the last process, which is another process which is in addition to preprint, around final submission to publication, which is 4 to 5 working days. The key difference here, beyond obviously making it citable, is that we typeset the content to make it NLM compliant, XML and PDFs, etc., but also capture detailed metadata, which is really important to maximize accessibility, readability, text mining, and all those things. So as I say, in a lot of ways, this is like a preprint. The key difference is that on submission, the authors commit formal invited peer review and cannot send this to a journal. So this is your preprint and your journal publication in one, essentially. Once it's published, the peer review process starts. The authors select referees from a predefined list. They can suggest others potentially, but we check those obviously for experience and potential conflicts. The referees provide a report and have an option of 3 different types of statuses. And those reports are published, but they're also all signed. So we require that those reports are signed. And we think it's actually important that those reports are signed and there's complete transparency there. Authors are in charge. There are no editors. The authors decide what they want to publish, when they want to publish it. They decide if they want to respond to the referees, and they decide if they want to revise, and then they decide when they want to stop. So they are in charge of this. And we've agreed with PubMed and other indexes the level of positive review it needs to achieve to become indexed. And you can see on the article, all the article titles include details of version number and referee status. And they're all on the right-hand side. You see it says exactly who the referees are and what's going on in the process. We find that actually the refereeing process goes very quickly. Given we're using the fully open peer review process, you can see the numbers on there, particularly welcome. You can see it's about a month to indexing. And there are 2 core reasons we think for this. One is that we have hands-on logistical support. And actually, although it sounds a very simple thing to invite referees and chase them, whatever, it's actually quite a lot of work to manage that and to ensure that that process really does happen. But the second key thing is that the referees get credit. And you can only really get credit if you're named and you're out there. The reports get DOIs and are citable and are cited. So this is an example of a referee report being cited. And they're included in ORCID profiles and publons and all sorts of things. We also encourage, and in fact, it's great to see that early career researchers, which we know in reality do a lot of the peer review, and we heard that yesterday, are getting credit for this too. So it's not unusual to see the situation here. You can see all 3 referees are actually pairs of referees, which are the people that we invited, and they're more junior colleagues. And this is a graph just showing the amount of co-refereeing or co-authoring of referee reports that we now see, which is really good to see. We've also built significant technology and infrastructure to underpin the system. The minute you add versioning, it gets incredibly complex, much more so than may be obvious initially. Done a lot of work to maximize the links with core infrastructure, which I think is really important, CoreKid, Crossref, but there's all sorts of parts of the system which really need interlinking. And also, as service providers, providing powerful tools to support authors and referees. Those are the core communities here to try and simplify the process of doing this and make it as easy as possible. Referee finders, report authoring systems, that kind of thing. So key things that we've learned from it, as I say, we sort of tweaked and adjusted it as we've gone on, but really we found that having the authors in charge and making the key decisions and having the whole process completely transparent, we certainly in our experience have not found it harder to get referees. I think because they can get less credit. The review process is faster, it's more constructive. The key part is obviously running the logistical operation to make sure that you do get the refereeing. I think transparency is crucial across the system to all parties, authors, referees, and readers who kind of get real benefits. And as providers of infrastructure and tools and editorial services, we're very keen to collaborate, not just with funders and institutions, but others that want to experiment. So we've already got the tools and the services there to try other experiments and adjust and look at certainly other communities as well, other areas of research where things I think probably are different. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Theo Bloom from the BMJ. I'm a life scientist by training, so like most of you, not a medic. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is some evidence from clinical journals about what works and what doesn't in peer review. And I'm going to echo Tony in bidding for more evidence about what we're talking about, less sort of faith-based positioning, if I can call it that. So I will talk about the open peer review we've used for a long time at BMJ, a number of experiments that have been done by current and former colleagues and also people unconnected to the BMJ. Hope to get to tell you about some ongoing research around conflicts of interest and some wrinkles that one encounters with open identities. So just to introduce the BMJ, as you're not medics, it's a journal with a long and proud history of campaigning, from the first issues that were about baby farming in Victorian London through smoking and lung cancer and various other things that medical journals campaign about. But one of the campaigns we're obviously here to focus on is about opening up the mysteries of peer review and how journals work. In terms of which version of open peer review we're talking about, from Tony's paper about the various different traits, I think I'm right about where the BMJ features on this table, although I'm not sure. But we have open identities, so authors and reviewers know who each other are. Open reports, so it's published articles have their full peer review history and reviewer reports published with those identities. And quite an active culture of commenting and people participating in post-publication commenting, which anyone can do. And what does that look like on a published article? If you're in an article, you'll be on the article tab, but you can click through to the peer review tab, which will tell you all previous versions of the document, the decision letters, what the editors said to the author, and so on. And you'll also be able to see on the top right comments and responses post-publication. And they're on another tab that will give you full details. So when it comes to studying peer review, it's hard work, but it isn't rocket science. And in my limited experience, not nearly as difficult studying how cells work. But the research I'm talking about today started with the development of a tool to say how good is this peer review. So, does the reviewer talk about the importance of the research question, its originality? Have they looked at the data? Have they looked at statistical issues? It's a long, long list. I've only shown you a few highlights, but that paper will give you the full details. And if you use that instrument to look at peer reviews, one of the earliest studies, I don't suppose it will surprise this audience to know, peer review doesn't find most problems. So a paper with 9 deliberately introduced major errors, like failure to give the sample size and for statistical review, which Mike talked so eloquently about, sent each reviewer the same paper. On average, people found between 2 and 3 of the major errors. And rather sadly, if you trained them either face-to-face or with an online package, it made no difference effectively. They still found between 2 and 3. And if there was an effect, it maybe notched you up a couple of decimal points between 2 and 3. That effect was short-lived after their training. How long should reviewers be spending on a paper? Does the review get better with the longer you spend on it? The answer is yes, up to about 3 hours of analysis, but beyond that, no. So again, these are things that are, you can study and find answers to. And what makes a good reviewer? And interestingly, I'm looking around the audience, they are mostly under 40, but they have some experience of the journal they're being asked to review for, and they have methodological training, specifically around things like statistics. There are other completed studies I'll just point to, like, do the figures and tables change much in published articles before and after peer review? The answer is not very much. Are author-suggested reviewers different from editor-suggested ones? And the result is, the main difference is they're more likely to recommend acceptance, which you might have expected, but it's always good to know. And I'll just point you to the journal's website, which has a full list of the sort of completed research projects on effects on peer review and publishing and authorship, various other aspects. I want to highlight a meta-analysis not done by people at the BMJ of studies across the sort of publishing ecosystem in biomedical journals. This is by Isabelle Boutron and colleagues and published in PMC Medicine. And they looked at those sort of controlled trials that have been done of different versions of peer review, of which, rather sadly, only 7 since 2004. So we had a burst of activity in this pre-2004, and there's been rather less since. So I've talked about training, but key is that addition of a statistical reviewer did improve the final manuscript. Use of a checklist on its own did not, and there are some nice studies coming out now about how you have to support the use of checklists, not just provide a checklist. Open peer review, which here meant open identities on Tony's categorization, improved the quality of the review report, didn't alter the time reviewers had to spend on review, but in some studies did decrease the rate of rejection. And this notion of blinded peer review, where authors and reviewers don't know who each other are, doesn't affect either the quality of the review or its rejection rate. That's all rather dry factoids I've given you. I would urge you to read the much funnier and more interesting summaries that Hilda Bastian provides, where she also gives you lovely cartoons to enjoy about peer review. And you can find a couple of key references there about openness and blinding in peer review. One ongoing study to talk about declaration of conflicts of interest. We all think that's important, right? And if you declare your conflicts, it's better. However, when we presented physicians with an education article written by someone at a phony pharmaceutical company and said either that the person had no conflict of interest, they were not at the pharmaceutical company, or they had funding or travel or other things provided by the company whose product was being recommended in the article, the confidence in the article was not affected at all by what the conflict of interest statement said. So in that specific example, we may all think declaration is good, but it didn't have any impact on people's understanding of the significance of the paper. Finally, just some wrinkles that happen. So our version of openness is open for accepted articles, but not for rejected ones. And we had a recent instance where some authors of a rejected paper took to social media to berate one of their reviewers who they felt had stood in the way of publication. And actually, in this instance, we thought they were completely wrong and unfair. And we sought permission from all the reviewers, the author, and everyone to actually post the pre-publication story of a rejected paper, which made plain that this particular reviewer had declared in full his conflicts of interest and had not recommended rejection, despite that the article was ultimately rejected. So just a note that obviously things do differ for rejected articles. Thanks. I think I'll stop there.
I'm going to focus on the first 2 this morning, but importantly, one of the advantages of us having all of these resources and be able to provide them is we're able to connect the literature to them. So I'm going to talk about 2 topics today. One is how our peer reviewers of journals review peer review of the journals, and also some open peer reviews that are already showing up in PubMed Central. So the first thing a journal has to do to get into either PMC or Medline is to pass our basic selection policy for the collection of the National Library of Medicine. And we don't think this is a very high bar, but there are a fair number of journals that want to come to the National Library of Medicine these days that don't meet it. This policy explicitly calls out peer review as one of the criteria that our staff is looking at to determine whether or not they qualify for the collection. So once a journal is deemed to qualify for a collection, depending on whether they're applying to submit full text to the PMC Journal Archive or to be indexed in Medline, the peer review process of the journal is an important part of the expert peer review of the journal. In both cases, the reviewers are people who are editors, scientists, authors, and librarians with extensive experience in scientific publishing and peer review. And the process is, in the words of our discussion from last evening, a review of the past evidence of that journal, not a predictive review. So we are looking at what the journal has done in the past and what those articles and production editorial quality looks like. We often have journals when they're found to fall short on some criteria or some expectation, come back and say, well, we fixed that now. And as most of you know, there is a waiting and observation period to ensure that they have fixed it. We tell them that a journal is a living, breathing organism, and we need to see its improvement moving forward, not at a point in time. So, of course, the reviewers can't, in most cases, directly observe the peer review process, except in some of the open peer review that we've talked about. So what they're looking for instead is evidence of peer review, or in the case of some journals, evidence of a lack of peer review, which can include observing any of these kinds of issues with the articles that the journal publishes. We do find that journals will apply for either the PubMed Central Archive or Medline and don't even have posted on their website a peer review process. They often do post one after we ask, where is it? So here are a couple of examples of policies that our reviewers would generally find insufficiently detailed and lacking. And here are a couple of examples of robust and detailed policies that our reviewers of journals are often looking for. You can see the one on the right runs all the way off the slide, which is good. And they're looking at these policies and looking at the evidence that it's actually followed. So I was asked to consider today if NLM would display open peer reviews. And as it turns out, including Rebecca, thank you, Faculty of 1000 and Welcome Open Research, we already have journals participating in PMC who are sending open peer review reports. So in this example from Faculty of 1000 Research, which based on the service platform is also used by Welcome Open Research, the peer review comments are included and identified in the XML, which enables us to build the peer review summary table, similar to what you saw earlier, clearly linking to all the versioning. And I think part of open science is seeing the versioning of the article after each peer review, so the scientists can judge, what they've seen occurred in the article. Here's another example from eLife, who sends us the editorial decision, review comments, and author response, and assign the XML that allows us to display it in this way. So I think the good news is that there are already open peer reviews on the publisher platforms and also in PMC where people can see them. And we actually have a technical way to do that already. So we welcome more submissions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Lynn. I'm the product director at Crossref. And I'm going to begin with going out and wading in the deep end for a little bit. I promise to bring it back within hopefully the time allotted and not a second after. But definitely, we will talk about peer reviews. I'm going to quickly go over a little bit about what we do for those of you who are not as familiar with Crossref as the publishers in the room. So we are a scholarly infrastructure provider. We are made up of about 10,000 members. All of those are publishers of some kind or another. If they publish, if they present materials online, then they are a publisher. There's a set of criteria that we also follow when we vet. But by and large, we are nonprofit member-driven organization. And what we do is we make sure that these links that are so critical to the advancement of science persist over time, that they can be cited, that they can be found, et cetera. And also that in doing so, the works are connected up to the full history. They're connected, very importantly, to the contributors that have been a part of this process through ORCIDS. And provenance, context, all of those are the key reasons for why we exist. So magic and mythology, now to go out on the deep end. It might be a world of a grinning Cheshire cat, a tired dormouse, or a Mad Hatter tea party, and croquet with a flamingo. But when you chase that rabbit down the hole and you find it's a world of hearsay and illusion, it doesn't give us rationality, it doesn't tell us truths about the world and how it works. This is the basis of what we do, is hacking open that black box of nature to dispel this magic, whether it's how planets move, the spread of viruses, the smell degeneration of aging flies, the unexpected complexity of CRISPR-Cas9 and active genetics-based trans-species replacement of the endogenous Drosophila, or whether it's knowledge itself, or, in fact, it's the human process of trying to understand nature, the research enterprise. Let magic be magic. This is science. Most of us in this room are preoccupied with one single common thing, whether you're a researcher or you're helping support scholarly communications mechanism, right? How do things work? What causes change? The process of communicating scholarly research has ironically become that same black box. Have we, in fact, regressed in this manner as our knowledge of the world has advanced? As our discussions already have shown very plainly yesterday, we needn't be. I'll quickly talk about what we at Crossref are doing to support this. So the world we live in, we all know, it's multi-platform, right? Assets are shared, stored in many places than ever before, especially as researchers are share increasingly number and different types of their contributions online. It's also one then where no single entity has the full view of what has happened or is happening with a set of research ideas. Not funders, not institutions. The publisher certainly does not. Even the researcher does not. So Crossref's scholarly infrastructure is to bring these identities, the identifiers, the metadata, and the assertions, linking them together and provisioning them to the entire research enterprise. What drives us is the following question. With all of these players and the produce of all of these players, how do we get a view of the ecosystem and its activities? Together, we can make these labors visible and the value concrete to the enterprise itself. So we do this through this, what I will reference as a massive research enterprise graph. But there are three rough categories of the metadata that we collect from publishers and harvest also from the web, based on the 91 million works registered with us right now. At the highest level, we have the associated research entities. Those are probably pretty obvious. The research outputs that are associated with, say, a journal article, those are also pretty obvious, data, software, protocols, et cetera. And then some of the events that occur after publication. This graph of the research enterprise for us is growing at a rate about 2 to 2.5 million records a month. So this metadata that we collect, it all depends, the use of it really depends on what your problem is, right? It's, as I would like to say, it's for almost any occasion, probably not birthday parties or bat mitzvahs or retirement celebrations. But you can see, what is your problem? Depending on what it is, it might be any number of different types of metadata in our system. And here, I'm just going to run through, this is not really for reading purposes, except to highlight that peer review is a very important part of many of the things that we want to do, whether it's to discover literature and build systems to support that, like recommendation engines, whether it's to dive into the research integrity of a particular set of research results, or reproducibility, or for those who are funders and are part of university institutions, reporting and assessment. Many of these will not be important. Some of those will be. It depends on the occasion, right? So this is my attempt to try to visualize how some of this all fits together. If you are to take then an article-centric view, it will differ based upon what is at your core. But just for example, the article center, it's connected up to many other literature, perhaps through citations, et cetera. But associated with the journal article itself are a lot of important associated research assets. Linking those up gives us a much better context about what's going on, no matter the occasion. And in the case of reproducibility, try to play and validate. What we've done is that while these are all links that do not require any particular form of identifier or another in our system, we noticed that peer reviews that are published can in fact have far more richer metadata that enriches the larger scholarly research graph. So starting about early last year, we worked with a number of our members who do practice open peer review, whether that's pre-publication or post-publication, and we worked with them on this particular problem. What about registering these published peer reviews as a separate entity that has custom metadata to properly support the types of systems that will want this information? And hence, a new content type specifically for reviews. We implemented it in a way to be big enough to accommodate any number of different types and variations of how publishers out there are practicing open peer review. So this includes then the possibility to register referee reports, editorial decision letters, author responses. This covers both pre and post publication types of reports. And this then gives us the metadata surrounding the research publication, much more information about what has happened to it. I won't really go through this list, we're running out of time, but I'll just point out a number of things that are really fascinating about this particular dedicated support for peer reviews. Publishers, many of these are optional, but those publishers who are interested in providing the recommendation decision in that review metadata can do so. The revision number, the type is also obviously important. And just to back up a few steps, obviously the contributor, whether it's the reviewer or the editor, or it's the author who provided that review report. All of this information is possible to capture them in a structured fashion. And we have a guide. Please come talk to me if you'd like to know the technical details of beginning to get started with registering the peer reviews. As of November, when we rolled out this dedicated metadata schema for peer reviews, we've since had 3 publishers begin to already start registering their content with us. You see them here. It's as of January 23rd, it's almost 10,000. And we're working with, say, F1000 to get theirs in the specific dedicated metadata schema that will showcase and tag a lot of the very important components that we've seen in our schema. So Clusterflock, I love this because it's a project that has the best name. It's an algorithm, but what it does is we collected links from the publisher as GigaScience. And so if you are to query the Crossref metadata for this particular DOI, you will get links to all of these associated assets. That means the systems that pick up this particular paper's metadata will get all of the other accompanying links. That means that systems who come across, say, the Docker Hub or the supporting data will also get led back to the paper itself, as well as a whole host of other links. This is the importance, and the possibilities are very, very endless, especially where it comes to peer reviews. So just to wrap up, we also are capturing, quote unquote, commentary on non-publisher platforms. What I spoke about before were publisher deposited metadata. Through our service event data, we're also collecting different types of commentary, whether it's commentary in reviews in the form of blogs or annotations or the F1000 Prime recommendations. They are also available and connected up to the DOI too. Okay, so yes, this is just a view of all of the different systems that consume the Crossref metadata. So whether you're a funder reporting system, very important to many of you, whether you are an analytics engine, this metadata, if it's in the Crossref database, then it can be made available freely. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everybody. So I'm Andrew Preston. I'm one of the co-founders of Publons, and I guess now managing director. So Bojana asked me to talk today about my experience in building the Publons platform, and I think some of the things that we've learned along the way. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Publons is, but then I think a bit about the history and some of the things that we have figured out as we've come along. So just a bit of background, I'm actually a physicist, so take that for what it's worth. I also have some training in economics. And those are probably the biases I bring to this discussion. But no matter what kind of researcher you are, I think generally you learn to recognize the importance of peer review. I certainly did as a PhD student and as a postdoc. And really it was for that reason that we founded this business. We thought that the peer review process takes up a huge chunk of time in the publishing process. If we could speed that up, we could speed up all of science. That's what we're here to do. So what is Publons? We basically make it very easy for researchers to get cross-publisher recognition for the peer review that they're doing. So we do that in a few ways. First of all, we make it possible for you as an individual researcher to create a record of all the reviews that you've done. So here's my personal and private record of all the reviews that I've done, going back through time. Some cool things we do here. If the paper goes on to be published, you can track citations, various alt metrics around that article. But where this gets really powerful is what you can start to do with this information once you've added it to Publons. So we create public profiles for researchers to the extent that they want to make this information public. This is my public profile, so public representation of my private work. I don't think I have a mouse, so can I try?
Remind me later.
Oh yeah. Some cool things we do on here. As an example, you can see that we connect up to ORCID and Researcher ID, things like that. So all of this work is connected together. You can see the different journals that I've reviewed for, and you can see some of the reviews that I've done. But I think a key point to make here is that we're not showing here the article that I reviewed. One of the things we figured out is that it's very important to recognize reviews, but many reviewers and many publishers and many authors do not want that to necessarily be open. So what we do, and what this green tick represents, is behind the scenes we verify that a review has happened. And so you can say that you reviewed for a journal on Publons without necessarily showing the article that you reviewed. It's very important. So how do you add reviews to Publons? You can, as a researcher, add them yourselves. We actually have a system where the thank you email that you receive from a journal when you do a review, you just forward that to reviews@publons.com. Or we partner with publishers and integrate directly into the editorial management systems that publishers use. In either case, we standardize, we verify, and we pull together the information and help you to create a Publons record. From that point, you have your private dashboard, but it takes 2 clicks to generate what we call as a downloadable record of your verified contributions. So this is basically a PDF that you can print out or attach to your CV. And what it contains is a verified record of all the reviews that you've done. And we do some work to contextualize that, to show how you are performing as a reviewer relative to your peers. This is very powerful, and the usage of this is actually starting to show up in various places. So I've got here an example of a researcher who used this particular, Matthias Lehn, used this particular report as part of his, I think, a promotion application. And we're seeing anecdotally this more and more. We're seeing now cases of senior researchers who are coming to us and registering for Publons because during the faculty application process, they're seeing researchers who are submitting these reports as part of their application. So we have well over 250,000 reviewers on the platform now, closing in on 2 million reviews, basically from every journal in the world. And we work with many of the top publishers. About 2,000 journals are integrated with Publons, although we're still waiting for, Nature, Phil, Science, Jeremy. So that's what Publons is today. I wanted to take a step back and show you some of the early days of Publons. We actually started Publons to be a peer review overlay layer for the archive. So I went back to the Wayback Machine, and here's a screenshot from an early version of Publons where we made it possible to look up any article, to rate, review, and discuss that article and build a profile. This is kind of like the no-brainer thing that everybody thinks needs to happen in research. But what do we learn? Few people used it. That was the big problem. Very few people used it. And so some key learnings we took away from that. Editors, or somebody who curates the discussion around post-publication peer review, are really very important. And in all the discussion, I think we tend to forget about that. the importance of that role. The other thing is, often we talk about trying to encourage new activities in research. One of the things I think we realized a few years ago is if we tap into activity that's already happening, we can maybe make a bit more change that way and try to encourage entirely new behaviors. And then two other things. Scale really matters. I had a conversation on the bus last night. We have 250,000 researchers on the platform. And I was talking to another researcher who said, well, I can't believe that you haven't promoted this more widely. More people need to know about this. So scale really, really matters. And incentives matter too. I think that we all intuitively understand that. But it's a very important thing that we picked up early on. The other thing we did a lot of work on, and we thought would be obvious, is that everything should be open. We should have open review. But as we built out Publons, we learned that relatively few researchers wanted it. We dug in and started to talk to a lot of people in the ecosystem. So we'd talk to reviewers and we'd say, why don't you want open review? And they would say, well, I don't think the editor wants it. And we'd talk to the editor and say, why don't you do open review? And the editor would say, well, I don't think the author wants it. And we'd talk to the author and the author would say, well, I don't really care. And so there are big coordination problems going on here. The other thing I think we realized is open first is a nice sentiment, but if you want to work with the natures, the publishers out there, you got to really work within the system. So we've built sophisticated systems to handle basically every journal peer review policy that there is out there. And it's actually a huge amount of engineering has gone into that. I'll just add that, so we work with a lot of publishers. 4 years ago, 3 years ago, nobody was talking about open review. But now all the major publishers that we work with are talking about this. So maybe the time is now. One other thing, tagging. Aaron mentioned tagging of articles last night. We still do have a reasonable amount of post-publication review on Publons. Here's an example of a Nature article published last year, or actually 2016 now. It was very popular, very high altmetric score, but a discussion sparked about this on Publons. And people had all sorts of issue with the statistics. And some of the tagging on Publons started to show that while it was a very interesting paper, the quality of the statistics was maybe lacking a little bit. This sort of stuff is incredibly useful. But how many of these things would we actually need for it to be truly useful? And I'm defining useful as these sorts of things would be used in the evaluation process. I'd say we have 100,000 now. I think we need to have millions before that's the case. So we take reviews, we collect them, and then we try to do useful things with them. So we make it possible for researchers to get recognition, we educate them. For publishers, we provide all sorts of services. What's missing in this picture is the funder. Incentives matter. We really need funders to start playing this place if we want to encourage innovation in peer review. Other thing I'd point out, about 8 months ago now, Publons was acquired by Clarivate Analytics, the home of Web of Science. That's the exact reason we joined Clarivate. With Publons as it was, we don't feel like we have the scale or the level of kind of relationship with funders and the ability to get to meetings like this. I think it's incredibly important that larger organizations, the funders, the publisher neutral entities, and the publishers are all playing a role in this space. So I just thought I'd flag that as a scale matters. And I'll leave it at that. We have training and all sorts of other things, but that's enough for today. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Kafui Drasa. I'm an assistant professor from Duke University. And I think I have 3 unique perspectives that I'd like to shape my time today. So for the last year and a half, I've been part of the congressionally mandated Next Generation Research Initiative. And so I've been thinking a lot about early career investigators and what role some of these changes might play in their development. Secondly, I'm a physician scientist. I'm a psychiatrist by training. So I think a lot about how emotional factors and perspective can really shape the decisions and behaviors choices that we make. And then finally, which is probably the least obvious, I am an African-American male. So this is titled A Tale of Two Talks, and two talks that I recently had the opportunity to participate in, and how those experiences have really shaped how I'm thinking through this issue that we're working with. So the first one, October 13th, 2016, I had the opportunity to sit on the stage with our last president and talk a lot about science. And so the shot here that's captured, we reached a part in this hour discussion where we were talking about why he loves science so much. And he was saying that the beauty about science is that you all are really rigorous, and then you come to a conclusion, and then there's truth, right? And he wanted to make sure everybody knew science so that they can agree upon truth at the end. Because I'm a scientist, I could never resist a good debate. I raised the point that scientists don't agree on things a lot of the times, right? And in fact, part of the process of science and part of the movement towards truth is going back and forth and debating, and then ultimately coming upon a larger consensus across the field. And I raised the question, I asked him, how can we bring that to politics? And so the shot there is when he said, his answer was, well, if I knew the answer to that, I'd run for president. So that's why he's laughing there. But that experience raised a really interesting point for me. And I think a lot of times we as scientists think that science exists in a vacuum, but it doesn't, right? And this is a little bit more for our audience here. But it's this idea that science is constantly interacting with the broader society. And as I think about the idea of open peer review, I wonder if there's a world in which the negative comments of one scientist could outweigh the 99,000 positive comments in another, right? And are we as scientists, have we thought about what that might look like if science then interfaces with the political arena, where that balance of truth that we as scientists agree on, right? We are willing to have one person disagree with the 99,000, and we're willing to ultimately, as a field, conclude that the 99,000 are most likely to be correct. Are there situations in which that balance can be lost? And certainly as we talk about some of our larger journals, we can think about this being a little bit far-fetched in the idea of like genetics or neuroscience, but some of these larger journals are actually publishing things from other fields, right? And these other fields, whether it's global warming or other issues, you could imagine these political situations in which those thoughts and perspectives can be outweighed. So that was my first observation, and I've been wrestling with how to navigate that in the discussion we're having, and that certainly doesn't mean I'm against this idea. The second thing the second observation that I had and I was thinking about was this idea, are there situations in which that disagreement or our process, right, how our sausage is made as scientists, can that be weaponized? And so I think about our society, right, which is an open, it's a free, it's a fair society. Most of the societies reflected by the folks in this room are that way. But are there societies in which it is very different, right, in which the one negative review of a scientist could be used to weaponize against a scientist in that society? And I think as the world is changing, we have more and more publications coming into our journals from those countries as well. The second thought is more from the consumption of the audience here in the room. So as I started to think about science being in this, there's a greater cultural context around society. What I've realized in participating on these committees as well is that the US has a huge interest in maintaining its dominance in science, right? It's part of why they fund science so much. There's an incredible investment in science, and we as a country want to be at the forefront. And as I've been thinking about the next generation of scientists, this is a talk I gave last summer it's a Gateways program that is tri-institutional, so between Sloan Kettering and Rockefeller and Cornell in New York. And they had a bunch of students there, and they're basically preparing what is the next generation of scientists. And my observation being in this room was that this next generation of scientists looks a lot different than the last generation of scientists. And it's actually been identified in Congress with the American Competitiveness Act that part of the future dominance of American society is learning to tap talent from all aspects and all backgrounds as well. And so I started to think a lot about our job as scientists and as more senior scientists is to nurture science and to prepare it for the next group of scientists to maintain American dominance. And so I wonder what this group would think about open peer review. And as I was talking to them, some of them first generation college students, lots of different backgrounds and experiences, lots of differences in terms of their socioeconomic status. What you really begin to appreciate is that they can tell that they're different from the environments they're in. Right. And so I started to try to uncover this idea. I'm a psychiatrist, right? So I started to try to uncover, look, what does this feeling of being different and what does it look like to go to a meeting and not see people that look like you? And what sort of thoughts come up as a result of that, right? And we talk a lot about bias, but what is pretty clear that vulnerable people appreciate is that the brain uses past experience to make future decisions. And whether or not you believe that happens, vulnerable people believe that happens. And so if you start talking about a scenario in which you have a young or junior investigator or somebody who's different, whose name is attached to a review, and they happen to be that negative review, what does it mean in terms of their perspectives on what happens when they put their brand in and how they will ultimately be treated if you believe that the brain uses past experiences to make future decisions? And so I think it's really important for us to think about how vulnerable people might move through a system in which peer review is not only open, but names are attached to it. And it is our responsibility, if we think that the best thing for science is to actually move in that position, to begin to think about the next generation and how to prepare our society and that next generation for that future. So the work should not only simply be done in moving science forward, but we should be moving the scientists forward as well, because there is no science without scientists. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank the organizers for creating this really interesting forum and for inviting me to witness it. My name is Natalie Ahn. I'm a researcher at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and I'm the president of ASBMB. And Lila Garash, who was scheduled to speak, who is the editor-in-chief of JBC, has the flu. And so I'm just going to give you some researchers' perspectives, which actually follow up on the last talk. I'd like to talk about one possible unintended consequence of open review, which raises questions: who reviews the reviewers, and also who reviews the public reviewing of the reviews. I have a story that comes from the data falsification side of publishing. I have a colleague who 10 or 20 years ago published several papers which contained manipulated images. One paper was discovered by a reader and posted on PubPeer and Retraction Watch, and that led to scrutiny of his work, and soon several articles were found with image falsification. And this was followed by retraction of articles by some of the journals. Other journals allowed him to correct the mistakes and or provide other measurements that confirmed the results. And it turned out that all of the images were generated by two trainees about 20 years ago. And you can look at these images and you can sort of see that some of them look like what they're trying to do with things like cover up schmutz on a gel, or in one case they wanted to show two cells instead of one, so they spliced two cells into one panel. Things that we now cover in RCR training, but that wasn't very common at the time. But they were missed by my colleague, and they led to article retractions. But importantly, these cases, at least in my opinion, did not meet the standards for scientific misconduct, which requires intentional and knowing misrepresentation of data. Still, while there was negligence, the open community review on various websites led to accusations within the very public accusations of misconduct and dishonesty on the part of my colleague. And as a result of the controversy, his institution suspended some of his appointments. Grants that he had pending were withdrawn by funding agencies. Papers that he entered a review were withdrawn by journals. And he's now working on each of these papers he's now found software that will open the old files, and he's which have replicates. And in some cases, he's collecting new data to confirm the findings, and whether he'll be able to recover his career is unknown. Now, in the past year, Lila Garash and JBC have hired new staff to examine all accepted articles for image accuracy, and there are now 3 full-time staff members working on this, and this should address concerns for the future. But what's informative are the results so far. We're up to 20% of accepted manuscripts showing some form of image manipulation. And usually there's simple problems like splicing gel lanes, but about 4% show data that would be in this category of data falsification. And for the JBC, that's about 80 articles per year, just from one journal. And so, and the senior authors include many well-known scientists, prominent individuals who you'd probably recognize, and they're shocked when they're informed of this. But like my colleague, they completely missed these errors before submitting. And so my point is that any of us could run into similar situations where one day we find that a paper we published 20 years ago gets retracted. And through the fast-moving digital environment, we lose our reputations. So in thinking about this in the context of open peer review, who reviews the reviewers? Most reviewers do as good a job as they can, but reviews are imperfect, and sometimes people make comments that are not accurate, and sometimes they make statements that are based on fact, not in fact, but rather opinion. And in the public domain, those who look at these and judge reviews may not have the discretion to know how to interpret them. And in fact, our experiments with social media are telling us what it's like when people have open commentary. Sometimes people make extreme statements or distort what they read because they don't know better, or sometimes they're out to get the world. And in these situations, a reviewer or an author has very little defense. So sort of in thinking about this, it seems like there may be risks of being transparent, although I certainly appreciate the strengths. But it seems that it's possible, while it may not have happened so far, you can get stuff that damages people, reviewers as well as authors. And that may damage the willingness of people to be good reviewers and say what they really think. And perhaps more importantly, you can get stuff that damages science, and particularly the public perception of science. And so something that might be worth considering as we discuss these issues. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank all the speakers today. This was great. I think it's going to be a great source of discussion for our breakout sessions, which is what we're going to move to now. Jessica told me that there are these AM and PM, 3A, 3B, that's on my badge here. That tells you where you're going for your breakout session. And if that still doesn't make sense, there's a flipboard outside, and I think there'll be some people directing you. But, so you've been assigned, there are note takers, and Jessica, is there something else I need to say? Yes. Oh, the Chatham House rule, right. That information may be shared, but not attributed to a particular person for this portion of the meeting. That's because we've got some reporters in the audience. Any other questions? It's going to be listed out there. They're duplicates. Yeah, there are 2 sessions each for each of the topics. Okay. And then we will come back after lunch, I believe, to have a discussion about what came up in the breakout sessions and also have questions for the speakers this morning. So I'd like to thank everybody again. And now we're going to really dig into it.